They set up a perfect Christmas injustice. A single mother desperate for help and an autistic man everyone ignored, both chosen to perform gratitude on stage while cameras captured their tears. But when Eli stood up with his strange, unshakable calm, refusing to let them turn Mara and her son into another heartwarming spectacle, he did something nobody expected. He disarmed an entire room with nothing but the truth they'd been hiding. What happened next would expose how charity had become a business, and why the quietest person in that auditorium was the only one brave enough to stop it. The first snowflake landed on Mara's palm outside the grocery store, delicate as a whispered promise, and she watched it melt into nothing before she could even make a wish. December had arrived in Ashford, Montana, with its usual cruelty, beautiful and cold, wrapping the town in lights she couldn't afford to buy, and warmth she couldn't afford to feel. She stood there longer than she should have, staring at the display of Christmas wreaths through the window, each one priced like a small miracle, while her grocery bag hung light against her hip because light meant cheap, and cheap meant surviving another week. Inside that bag were 3 cans of soup, a loaf of bread that would last 4 days if she stretched it right, and a single candy bar she'd bought for Leo, even though the guilt of spending those $2 would follow her home like a shadow. She could already hear his voice in her head, soft and careful, asking if they were going to have a tree this year, and she didn't know how to tell a 6-year-old that trees cost money, and money was a language she'd stopped speaking fluently the day his father walked out without leaving so much as a forwarding address or an apology. The wind picked up, sharp enough to sting, and Mara pulled her coat tighter, even though the zipper had broken 2 weeks ago, and she'd been using a safety pin ever since. Across the street, the community center glowed like a promise wrapped in red and green, its windows fogged with warmth, its doors opening and closing as families streamed in and out, carrying boxes marked with cheerful labels that read, "Christmas Blessing Giveaway." She'd seen the flyers taped to every lamppost in town, glossy paper printed with snowflakes and smiling children, words like hope and community and togetherness arranged in fonts that looked expensive. For 3 days, she'd walked past those flyers without stopping, telling herself she didn't need charity, didn't need anyone's pity, didn't need to stand in line with her head down while strangers decided if she was poor enough to deserve help. But then Leo had come home from school with a drawing of Santa Claus and a list of wishes written in his careful, shaky handwriting, and Mara had felt something crack open inside her chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope. She crossed the street slowly, her boots crunching over salt-stained pavement, and pushed through the community center doors into a wall of sound and heat. Voices overlapped in a bright, chaotic hum, children laughing and crying and running between tables stacked high with donated toys, volunteers in matching red vests directing traffic with smiles that seemed painted on. Mara stood just inside the doorway, suddenly aware of how small she felt, how out of place, like she'd walked into a party she wasn't invited to and everyone could tell. A woman with perfect blonde hair and a sweater covered in embroidered snowflakes approached her with a clipboard, her smile wide and white and just a little too bright, the kind of smile that made Mara feel like she was being measured and categorized before she'd even spoken. The woman introduced herself as Caroline, the volunteer coordinator, and asked Mara if she was there to sign up for the giveaway, and the way she said it, gentle, almost pitying, made Mara want to turn around and walk back out into the cold. But she thought of Leo's drawing, of the empty space under the window where a tree should be, and she nodded instead. Caroline's questions started simple and then turned sharp without ever losing that sugary tone. Did Mara work? Part-time at the diner, Mara said, and watched Caroline's pen pause like the answer wasn't quite good enough. Where was Leo's father? Gone, Mara said, and felt the word land heavy and shameful between them. Did Leo have any special needs they should be aware of? Mara hesitated, because the truth was complicated and the lie was easier. But she'd learned the hard way that lies had a way of catching up to you when you least expected it. She told Caroline that Leo was autistic, that loud noises and crowds overwhelmed him, that sometimes he needed space and quiet and patience, and she watched Caroline's smile tighten just slightly at the corners, A microscopic shift that most people wouldn't notice, but Mara had learned to read like a second language. Caroline made a note on her clipboard, nodded slowly, and said they'd do their best to accommodate him, and Mara knew immediately that do their best meant nothing at all. She was filling out paperwork at a table near the back when she first saw him. A man standing alone by the doorway, so still he almost seemed like part of the wall, his hands clasped in front of him, and his gaze fixed somewhere just past the crowd. He wore a jacket that had seen better winters, faded blue with a small tear near the shoulder, and his hair was slightly too long, falling across his forehead in a way that made him look younger than he probably was. People moved around him the way water moves around a stone, not quite seeing him, not quite acknowledging his presence, and Mara recognized that invisibility because she'd worn it herself more times than she could count. A teenage volunteer walked past him carrying a box of tinsel, bumped his shoulder without apologizing, and rolled her eyes when he didn't move out of the way fast enough. The man didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't say a word, just stood there with that same strange stillness, and Mara felt something tug at her chest, something uncomfortably close to recognition. Her pen slipped, and the stack of papers slid off the table, scattering across the floor in a mess of white and red ink. Mara bent down quickly, cheeks burning with embarrassment, trying to gather them before anyone noticed, and then a pair of hands appeared beside hers, moving with careful precision. The man from the doorway knelt next to her, picking up each paper and arranging them in perfect order, edges aligned, corners matched, his movements slow and deliberate like he was handling something fragile. He didn't look at her, didn't speak, just placed the stack back into her hands with the same quiet care, and Mara found herself staring at him, at the way his fingers trembled slightly before he pulled them back, at the way he still wouldn't meet her eyes. She wanted to say thank you, but before she could find the words, he spoke first, his voice soft and flat and strangely certain. He said, "They're going to pick you." Just that, nothing more. And then he stood and walked back to his spot by the door, leaving Mara kneeling on the floor with her papers and a question she didn't know how to ask. She turned in her application and left the community center with her head spinning, the man's words echoing in her mind like a prophecy she didn't understand. They're going to pick you. How could he possibly know that? She didn't even know that. She walked home through streets lined with houses that glowed like snow globes, warm and golden and completely untouchable, and tried not to think about how easily hope could turn into humiliation if she let herself believe too much. Leo was waiting for her when she got home, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor with his toy cars arranged in perfect rows, and he looked up at her with those wide, serious eyes that always seemed to see more than she wanted to show. He asked if she'd signed them up for the giveaway, and Mara said yes, and he smiled, small and careful, like he was trying not to break something fragile. That night she lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the furnace rattle, and she couldn't stop thinking about the man's hands arranging her papers, couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd known something she didn't, couldn't stop thinking about the strange, unsettling calm in his voice. 3 days later, the call came. Caroline's voice on the other end of the line, bright and congratulatory, telling Mara she'd been selected as one of the recipients for the Christmas blessing giveaway. Mara's first reaction was relief, sharp and overwhelming, the kind that makes your knees weak and your throat tight. Her second reaction was shame, hot and familiar, because needing help felt like admitting defeat, and admitting defeat felt like failing Leo. Caroline explained that there would be a ceremony on Christmas Eve, that Mara and Leo would be seated in the front row, that the local news might be there, that it would be a beautiful celebration of community and generosity. She used words like highlight and showcase and inspiring story, and each one landed on Mara like a weight she hadn't agreed to carry. She said yes anyway, because what else could she say, because Leo deserved a real Christmas, even if it came wrapped in someone else's agenda, because sometimes survival meant swallowing your pride and smiling for the cameras. That afternoon, she went back to the community center to drop off some additional paperwork, and she saw him again. The man from before, sitting alone in a corner with his hands folded in his lap, staring at a small plastic Christmas tree on a nearby table, like he was counting each individual light. A volunteer walked past him and muttered something under her breath, and another volunteer laughed, quick and mean, the kind of laugh that's designed to exclude. And Mara felt something dangerous rise in her chest because she knew exactly what that laughter meant, and exactly how it felt to be on the receiving end of it. What do you think Eli is planning? Do you think Mara should trust him, or is she walking into something even more dangerous? Put your thoughts in the comments below. The man didn't react to the laughter, but Mara saw his fingers press into his palm. 1, 2, 3, a rhythm that looked like counting or prayer or both. And she recognized that gesture because Leo did the same thing when the world became too loud or too sharp or too much. She felt something protective and furious rise in her chest, something that made her walk over without thinking, placing herself between him and the volunteers who were still whispering and smirking like cruelty was just another form of entertainment. The room went quiet in a way that felt like accusation, like she'd broken some unspoken rule by acknowledging his existence, and Mara suddenly understood that this man's invisibility wasn't accidental. It was enforced. Caroline appeared at her elbow almost instantly, her smile bright and her eyes sharp, asking if everything was okay, asking if Mara needed help with something, asking in a tone that wasn't really asking at all but warning. Then Caroline's gaze shifted to the man, and her smile changed, became something thinner and more calculated, like she was recalculating numbers in her head. She asked, almost casually, "You two know each other?" And Mara realized, with a cold certainty that settled in her stomach like ice, that the question wasn't casual at all. It was a test. It was a trap. It was the beginning of something she couldn't yet see but could already feel closing in around them both like a net she hadn't noticed until it was already tightening. The man looked up for the first time, met Mara's eyes for half a second, and in that brief glance she saw something that made her breath catch. Recognition, warning, and a calm so deep it felt like resignation, like he'd been through this before and knew exactly how it would end. Then he looked away, and Mara heard herself say, without knowing why, without understanding the weight of what she was doing, "Yes, we know each other." And Caroline's smile widened, and Mara knew, with absolute certainty, that she'd just made a mistake she didn't yet understand. She left the community center with her heart pounding and her mind racing, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just stepped into a story someone else had already written. A story where she and this silent man were characters whose lines had been decided before they ever opened their mouths. That night, Leo asked her about the ceremony, asked if there would be a lot of people, asked if they would clap, and Mara didn't know how to answer because she didn't know if the clapping would sound like celebration or judgment. She tucked him into bed and sat in the dark living room, staring at her phone, at Caroline's follow-up text that had arrived an hour ago with a single line that made her stomach turn. The text said, "Bring your friend Eli too. It'll make the story even better." Mara stared at the name, Eli, and realized she'd never asked him for it, never heard anyone say it, and yet Caroline had it ready like she'd been keeping a file, like she'd known about him all along. She thought about the way Eli had known they'd pick her before she'd even finished her application. She thought about the way he'd arranged her papers with trembling hands, about the way he'd said nothing when the volunteers laughed, and she wondered what kind of story Caroline thought she was building, and whether Mara and Eli were characters in it, or just props. The next morning she found Eli outside the community center, standing in the same spot by the door like he'd never left, like he'd been waiting for her. And maybe he had been. She walked up to him slowly, carefully, the way you approach someone who might startle, and for the first time, she spoke directly to him, her voice low enough that no one else could hear. She asked him how he knew they'd pick her, asked him what Caroline meant by making the story better, asked him if he understood what was happening because she was starting to feel like she didn't, like she'd signed up for something she couldn't see the shape of yet. Eli didn't answer right away. He stood there in his faded jacket, hands clasped, gaze fixed on some invisible point beyond her shoulder. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and measured and devastatingly precise, like every word had been chosen with surgical care. He said the giveaway wasn't what it looked like. He said some people received real help, and some people were chosen for something else, something performative, something designed to make donors feel good about themselves without actually changing anything that mattered. He said they would push her, push Leo, push them both into a spotlight neither of them asked for, and call it inspiration, call it community, call it Christmas magic, when really it was just theater designed to make wealthy people feel less guilty about their wealth. And then he said, in that same flat, certain tone, "They like stories. They don't like truth." Mara wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was wrong, wanted to believe that Caroline's smile was genuine and the giveaway was exactly what it claimed to be. Because believing anything else meant accepting that she'd walked into a trap with her son's hand in hers. But she thought about the way Caroline had asked where Leo's father was, the way her pen had paused when Mara mentioned autism, the way she'd called Eli Mara's friend without ever asking if that was true, without ever considering that maybe they'd just met. Maybe they were just two people trying to survive the same cold December. She thought about the text message, about being told to bring Eli like he was part of a script she hadn't read yet, like his presence would add the right amount of drama or sympathy or whatever emotion Caroline was trying to manufacture for the cameras. She thought about the word highlight and how it made her feel like an exhibit in a museum, something to be observed and pitied and quickly forgotten once the donors had their emotional fix and moved on to the next charity event. Eli finally looked at her, just for a moment, and his eyes were calm and sad and unbearably knowing. He said, "If they can make you look helpless, they can make themselves look holy." And Mara felt the last of her hope shift into something sharper, something closer to anger, because she realized he wasn't guessing. He was remembering. She asked him how he knew so much, and Eli said simply that they'd done this before. Not to him, but to someone he'd known. Someone who'd stood on that same stage and smiled for the cameras and received help that came with strings attached. Strings that tightened until there was nothing left but performance and shame and a hollow kind of gratitude that felt more like debt. Mara felt her hands start to shake, felt the weight of her own naivety pressing down on her shoulders like wet snow. And she wanted to walk away from the whole thing. Wanted to tell Caroline to keep her charity and her cameras and her perfect Christmas story. But then she thought about Leo's drawing, about the empty space where a tree should be, about the candy bar she'd bought with guilt, and the 3 cans of soup that were supposed to last a week, about the electricity bill she couldn't pay, and the rent that was already 2 days late. She thought about how close they were to losing everything, and how far she'd go to keep her son safe. And she realized with sick clarity that she didn't actually have the luxury of walking away. Eli must have seen it on her face, because he nodded slightly, like he'd expected this too, like he'd known from the beginning that she wouldn't be able to refuse no matter how much she wanted to. And he said, very quietly, "Then we'll have to be ready." And Mara didn't know what that meant, but she felt it settle into her chest like a promise or a warning or both. And for the first time since she'd walked into that community center, she didn't feel completely alone. She asked him what he meant by ready, and Eli looked at her with those calm, ancient eyes and said something that made her realize he wasn't just a victim of whatever Caroline was planning. He was someone who'd learned how to survive it. He said, "They need you to play the part they've written, but nobody said you had to stick to the script." And Mara felt something shift inside her, something that felt dangerous and necessary, like the moment right before you jump into cold water knowing it's going to hurt, but also knowing you don't have any other choice. She thought about Leo, about the way he arranged his toy cars in perfect rows because chaos scared him, about the way he asked questions that cut straight to the truth because he didn't know how to lie yet, hadn't learned that sometimes people preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. The days leading up to Christmas Eve felt like waiting for a storm that everyone could see coming but no one wanted to acknowledge. Mara went through the motions of her life, serving coffee at the diner, helping Leo with his homework, folding laundry in the dim light of their apartment. but her mind kept circling back to Eli's words, like a record with a scratch in it. They need you to play the part they've written, but nobody said you had to stick to the script. She started paying attention to things she'd missed before, small details that suddenly seemed important. The way Caroline's texts always came with specific instructions: what to wear, when to arrive, how to style Leo's hair, like she was directing a play instead of organizing charity. The way the community center's social media posted carefully cropped photos of families in need, without ever showing their faces clearly, just emotional silhouettes that could be anyone, could be everyone, could be the perfect blank canvas for donor sympathy. Mara met with Eli twice more before the ceremony, brief encounters outside the community center where he spoke in his careful, measured way, laying out what he'd observed over the years. He told her about the Hendersons, a family who'd been featured in the giveaway 3 years ago, how they'd been promised job connections and housing assistance but received only gift cards and a grocery basket once the cameras stopped rolling. He told her about Marcus Chen, a veteran who'd been asked to cry on command for a promotional video and refused, then mysteriously got removed from the recipient list. Each story Eli shared felt like pulling back a curtain to reveal machinery nobody was supposed to see, the careful orchestration of emotion, the selection of recipients based not on need, but on visual appeal, the way suffering became currency as long as it photographed well. Mara realized the giveaway wasn't about helping people climb out of poverty. It was about making poverty look beautiful and temporary, something that could be solved with a single night of generous applause and a tax-deductible donation. Leo sensed something was wrong the way children always do, with an instinct that bypasses language and logic. He became quieter than usual, arranging his toy cars with more precision, asking questions that Mara didn't know how to answer. "Mom, why do people want to watch us open presents?" he asked one night, and Mara felt her throat close because she didn't have a good answer, didn't have any answer that wouldn't make him feel like a spectacle. She tried to explain it in terms he might understand, that some people wanted to help, that they were going to say thank you in front of other people, that it would be loud and bright but would be over soon. Leo listened with his serious face, the one that made him look older than 6, and then asked the question that broke her heart. Will they still like us after? And Mara realized he already understood, in his own way, that their value to these people was conditional, temporary, dependent on how well they performed gratitude. The night before the ceremony, Mara couldn't sleep. She lay in bed listening to the radiator clank and hiss, thinking about what Eli had said about not sticking to the script. She thought about all the times in her life she'd made herself smaller to fit into spaces that weren't designed for her. Bad relationships, degrading jobs, conversations where she swallowed her pride because survival required it. She thought about the script Caroline had written for her, the story of the struggling single mother and her special needs child, saved by the generosity of strangers. But Mara knew her story was more complicated than that, knew that poverty wasn't a moral failing that charity could erase, knew that Leo wasn't broken just because his brain worked differently. She thought about what it would mean to refuse the script, to stand on that stage and tell a different kind of truth, and the thought terrified her because she didn't know what would happen after. Would they take away the help they'd promised? Would they humiliate her in front of everyone? Would Leo suffer for her defiance? She got out of bed and walked to Leo's room, stood in the doorway watching him sleep with his arms wrapped around his favorite stuffed elephant. In the dim light from the street lamp outside, he looked peaceful and perfect, and completely unaware that tomorrow people would be watching him, like he was a story instead of a person. Mara made a decision then, standing in that doorway, a decision that felt like jumping off a cliff without knowing if there was water below. She wasn't going to perform for them. She wasn't going to cry on command or deliver the lines Caroline expected. She wasn't going to let them turn Leo into a prop for someone else's Christmas spirit. And if that meant walking away with nothing, if that meant facing the cold reality of their situation without the cushion of charity, then that's what she'd do. Because some prices were too high to pay even when you were desperate. The next morning, Christmas Eve arrived bright and brittle, the sky so blue it looked painted, the kind of perfect winter day that belonged in movies about families who never struggled. Mara dressed Leo in his cleanest clothes, the navy sweater her mother had sent last year, and the khakis that were getting too short but would have to do. She watched him in the mirror as she combed his hair, saw the anxiety in his shoulders, the way he was already preparing himself for sensory overload. She knelt down to his level and took his hands. "Leo, listen to me. If it gets too loud, if you need to leave, you tell me. I don't care what anyone says or what's happening on that stage. You tell me, and we leave. Okay?" He nodded, but his eyes were wide and uncertain, and Mara felt rage bloom in her chest again. Rage at a system that would put a 6-year-old through this just to make rich people feel good about themselves. Her phone buzzed with another text from Caroline.
"Can't wait to see you both. Remember, front entrance at 6. We'll have someone escort you to your seats. This is going to be magical." Mara stared at the word, magical, and thought about all the ways magic was just another word for illusion, for making people see what you wanted them to see instead of what was really there. She texted back a simple, "See you there," and slipped her phone into her pocket.
As they walked to the community center through streets lined with Christmas lights, Mara spotted Eli standing near a lamppost half a block from the entrance. He was wearing the same faded jacket, hands in his pockets, watching the building with that same careful stillness. When he saw them approaching, he fell into step beside them, without saying a word. And Mara felt oddly comforted by his presence, by the quiet solidarity of someone who understood what they were walking into. The community center had been transformed into something that belonged in a catalog, all twinkling lights and artificial snow, red velvet bows tied around every possible surface like someone had gift-wrapped the entire building. Music poured through the open doors, cheerful and loud, the kind of aggressive holiday cheer that felt less like celebration and more like drowning. Leo's hand tightened in Mara's as they approached, and she felt him start to pull back, his body already recognizing what his mind hadn't yet processed, that this place was designed for everyone except him. Caroline spotted them immediately, her smile so bright it could have powered the Christmas lights, and she swept toward them with her clipboard and her perfectly coordinated outfit, a vision of holiday efficiency.
"There you are! Oh, Leo, don't you look handsome? And Eli, so glad you could make it!"
She said his name like they were old friends, like she hadn't been the one whose volunteers had laughed at him just days ago. She gestured toward the entrance with one manicured hand, directing them like traffic, and Mara noticed the way her eyes kept darting to the small camera crew setting up near the stage. They were ushered through a side entrance, past the crowd already gathering in the main hall, past tables laden with cookies and punch that Leo wouldn't be able to eat because textures were complicated and new foods were risky. A young volunteer with a headset and an overly enthusiastic smile led them to 2 seats in the very front row, dead center, positioned perfectly for the cameras that were now multiplying like they'd been breeding in the corners. Leo sat down and immediately started counting under his breath, his fingers tapping against his leg in that familiar rhythm. Eli was directed to a seat several rows back, separated from them in a way that felt deliberate, and Mara caught his eye as he sat down. He gave her the smallest nod, barely perceptible, and she understood it as reassurance or warning, or both. The hall filled quickly, families and donors and local officials, everyone dressed in their holiday best, everyone performing the ritual of charitable Christmas spirit. Mara watched them settle into their seats, watched them pull out their phones to take photos, watched them smile and chat like this was entertainment instead of people's actual lives. The lights dimmed and brightened twice, a signal that the show was about to begin, and Mara felt her heart start to race in a way that had nothing to do with excitement. A man in an expensive suit took the stage, the kind of suit that cost more than Mara made in 3 months, and began speaking into a microphone about community and generosity and the true meaning of Christmas. His words were smooth and practiced, delivered with the confidence of someone who'd never had to choose between groceries and electricity, never had to explain to a child why Santa might skip their house this year. He introduced the sponsors, local business owners, the wealthy Whitmore family who'd funded most of the event, a state representative who was clearly there for the photo opportunity, and each one stood to receive applause that sounded like validation, like proof that writing a check absolved you of any deeper responsibility. Mara watched Mrs. Whitmore waved from her seat in the third row, diamond bracelet catching the stage lights, her smile serene and self-satisfied, and wondered if the woman had any idea what poverty actually looked like beyond these carefully staged encounters. Then came the stories. One by one, recipients were called to the stage to share their struggles, and Mara watched the pattern emerge with sickening clarity. Each story was tragic but ultimately hopeful, each person grateful and tearful, and perfectly packaged for emotional consumption. A single father who'd lost his job, a grandmother raising 3 grandchildren, an immigrant family rebuilding after a house fire. Real pain, real need, but presented like acts in a play, each one building to the moment where they received their blessing, and everyone could applaud and feel like they'd participated in a miracle. Leo was getting more agitated with each story, the noise and lights and emotional intensity pressing against him like physical weight. Mara put her arm around his shoulders and whispered reassurances, but she could feel him trembling, could see the way his eyes had gone distant and unfocused, the way he did when he was trying to escape into his head, because the outside world had become unbearable. She wanted to stand up and leave, wanted to grab his hand and walk out before their turn came. But Caroline was watching them from the side of the stage, her expression pleasant, but her posture tense. Then Mara heard her name, not called exactly, but mentioned in the host's introduction. "Our next family has a particularly touching story," he was saying, his voice dripping with manufactured emotion. "A single mother, working tirelessly to provide for her son. A beautiful boy with autism who faces challenges every single day. Let's welcome Mara and Leo Thompson." The applause started before Mara could process what was happening, a wave of sound that crashed over them, and she felt Leo flinch beside her, felt his whole body go rigid with panic. Caroline appeared at their row, gesturing for them to come up, her smile still locked in place, but her eyes sharp with expectation. Mara stood slowly, taking Leo's hand, feeling him resist, feeling the terror in his grip. She looked back at the audience, at all those faces turned toward them with curiosity and sympathy, and that peculiar hunger people have for other people's pain when it's safely contained within a narrative they can understand. And she looked past them, to where Eli sat perfectly still, watching her with those calm, knowing eyes. The walk to the stage felt eternal, each step an exercise in maintaining composure while Leo's hand squeezed hers so hard it hurt. The lights were brighter up there, hotter, the kind of lights designed to make everything look magical on camera, but that felt like interrogation in person. The host handed Mara a microphone, his smile encouraging, his hand on her shoulder just a little too familiar, and she understood in that moment exactly what Eli had been trying to warn her about. This wasn't help, this was theater, and she was expected to perform. The host asked his first question, something about what Christmas meant to her family, and Mara opened her mouth to give the expected answer, the grateful, humble response that would make everyone feel good about being here. But then she looked at Leo, at the way he was staring at the floor with his hands pressed over his ears, even though the applause had stopped, at the way he was suffering for an audience that saw his pain as inspiration. She looked at Mrs. Whitmore in the third row, at Caroline waiting in the wings with her clipboard, at the cameras recording every second. And Mara realized that Eli had been right about something else too. She didn't have to stick to the script. She could walk off this stage right now, could refuse to perform, could tell them all exactly what she thought of their charity that required humiliation as payment. The microphone felt heavy in her hand, and for a long moment she stood there in the spotlight, silent, while the audience waited for her to give them the story they'd come to hear. The host's smile started to flicker, just slightly, and Caroline took a step forward from the wings. But before Mara could speak, before she could decide what truth she was brave enough to tell, something unexpected happened. Eli stood up from his seat in the back rows, not dramatically, not making a scene, just rising quietly to his feet in that same unhurried way he did everything. And the simple act of him standing, of him refusing to sit politely while they turned Mara and Leo into a spectacle, changed the energy in the room like someone had opened a window and let in cold air. People started to notice Eli standing there, heads turning in confusion, whispers rippling through the audience like wind through grass. He didn't say anything, didn't move toward the stage, just stood with his hands at his sides and his gaze fixed on Mara, with an expression that somehow communicated everything he couldn't say out loud. That she wasn't alone, that he saw what was happening, that whatever she decided to do next, someone would witness it as truth instead of entertainment. Caroline moved quickly, gesturing to security with sharp, urgent movements, her smile finally cracking at the edges. But security hesitated, because Eli wasn't doing anything wrong, wasn't threatening anyone, wasn't even speaking. He was just standing, just existing in a space that hadn't been designed to accommodate his existence. The host tried to regain control, turning back to Mara with forced cheer, asking her again about Christmas traditions, trying to pull the narrative back on track before it derailed completely. Mara looked at the microphone in her hand, then at Leo trembling beside her, then at Eli standing alone in a sea of seated people, and something inside her snapped. Not with anger exactly, but with clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you finally stop lying to yourself. She brought the microphone to her lips and said very quietly, "My son is terrified right now. He's autistic, and this, all of this, is overwhelming for him. The lights, the noise, the cameras. But we're up here anyway because you wanted us to be." The room went still in a way that felt different from the polite attention they'd been giving the previous speakers. This was the uncomfortable stillness of people suddenly aware they might be witnessing something they weren't supposed to see, something that might require them to feel complicit instead of charitable. The host's smile froze, and Caroline took another step forward, but Mara kept talking before anyone could stop her, her voice steady and low and absolutely certain. "I'm grateful for help. I need help. But I don't need to be your Christmas story." She felt Leo's hand tighten in hers, felt him press closer to her side, and she squeezed back, trying to tell him without words that it was almost over, that they were almost done. "My son isn't inspiration. He's a kid who likes toy cars and hates loud noises, and shouldn't have to perform gratitude to strangers just so we can afford groceries. And that man standing in the back, his name is Eli, and he tried to warn me this would happen. Mrs. Whitmore shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her serene smile wavering. Several donors exchanged glances that looked less like sympathy and more like guilt, finally finding its target. A woman in the second row pulled out her phone, not to take a photo, but to record. And Mara saw Caroline notice, saw panic flash across the coordinator's face because suddenly the script had been thrown out and the cameras were capturing something real instead of something manufactured. The host reached for the microphone, tried to take it back with a laugh that sounded strangled, but Mara held on. "You asked what Christmas means to my family," she said, and her voice was getting stronger now, finding its rhythm. "It means my son feeling safe. It means not having to pretend our poverty is beautiful or temporary or something that can be fixed with one night of applause. It means being treated like people instead of projects. And if that's not what this is about, then I think we should leave." She handed the microphone back to the host before he could respond, took Leo's hand, and started walking toward the stage steps. The audience sat in shocked silence, nobody quite sure if they should clap or protest or look away. Caroline rushed toward them, her clipboard clutched like a weapon, her voice a harsh whisper. "Mara, what are you doing? You're ruining everything. We have donors here. We have media—" But Mara kept walking, kept moving toward the exit, and Leo stayed close beside her, his breathing starting to even out now that they were moving away from the lights. Eli met them at the end of their row, falling into step beside them without a word, and together the three of them walked toward the exit while the hall remained frozen in that terrible, uncertain silence. Behind them, Mara heard the host trying to recover, making some joke about strong emotions and the holiday spirit, trying to steer the event back toward comfortable territory. But the damage had been done. Not to the event exactly, but to the illusion that had been holding it together, the illusion that charity could be beautiful as long as nobody asked too many questions. They pushed through the doors into the cold December night, and Mara felt Leo immediately relax, his shoulders dropping, his breathing deepening as the sensory assault of the hall fell away behind them. He looked up at her with those serious eyes and said, "Thank you, Mom." And Mara had to bite her lip to keep from crying, because she'd spent so long thinking she was failing him, when maybe the real failure would have been teaching him that his dignity was negotiable. Eli walked with them for several blocks in silence, his hands in his pockets, his gaze on the sidewalk. Finally, he said, "You did the right thing." His voice was quiet, but certain, and Mara realized this was the most words she'd heard him string together at once. They'll be angry, they might retaliate. But you told the truth, and that matters more than their anger. Mara didn't know if she believed that yet. Didn't know if truth was worth the cost when the cost might be the help her family desperately needed. But as they walked through streets lined with houses glowing warm and golden, she thought about the alternative, standing on that stage, performing gratitude, teaching Leo that his worth was measured by how well he could make other people feel good about themselves. She thought about all the families who'd come before them, who'd smiled for the cameras and swallowed their dignity because they didn't have any other choice. She thought about Eli's friend, the one who'd received help with strings attached, strings that tightened until there was nothing left but performance and shame. They reached Mara's apartment building, shabby and cold but mercifully quiet, and Leo ran ahead to the stairs, already talking about his toy cars, the crisis of the ceremony already fading because children are resilient in ways adults forget how to be. Mara turned to Eli, wanting to thank him but not quite knowing how, wanting to ask him why he'd stood up in that moment, what had made him risk drawing attention to himself when he spent so much energy trying to remain invisible. Eli seemed to understand the question she wasn't asking. "My sister," he said so quietly Mara almost missed it. 3 years ago. The Hendersons, that was her family. They made her talk about her disability on camera, made her cry about her dead husband, gave her a grocery basket and a news story that got 1 million views. 6 months later, nothing had changed, except everyone in town recognized her as that poor woman from the Christmas thing. She killed herself in April. The words landed like stones in still water, rippling outward, and Mara felt something crack open in her chest. She reached out without thinking and touched Eli's arm, just briefly, and he flinched but didn't pull away. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and he nodded once, accepting it. And then he turned and walked away into the December darkness, his figure growing smaller until the shadows swallowed him completely. Mara stood there for a long moment, breathing the cold air, thinking about Eli's sister and all the other people who'd been turned into stories, thinking about the cost of survival, when survival required you to become someone else's inspiration. Then she went upstairs to where Leo was waiting, to their small apartment with its broken heater and empty space where a tree should be, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel after walking away from guaranteed help. She felt free. Christmas morning arrived quiet and gray, the kind of morning that feels like the world is holding its breath. Mara woke early, her body still tense from the night before, half expecting angry phone calls or some kind of retaliation for what she'd done on that stage. But her phone sat silent on the nightstand, and the apartment was peaceful, except for the familiar sounds of Leo already awake in his room, talking softly to his toy cars as he arranged them in their daily configurations. She made coffee with the last of the grounds, rationing it carefully because she didn't know when she'd be able to buy more, and stood by the kitchen window watching snow begin to fall in lazy spirals. The view from their apartment wasn't much, a parking lot, a dumpster, the back of another building, but the snow made it look almost beautiful, covering the ugly parts with temporary grace. She thought about what she'd say to Leo about Christmas, about presents she couldn't afford, and magic she couldn't manufacture. But when Leo came into the kitchen, he didn't ask about presents. He climbed into the chair next to her, still in his pajamas, and said, "Mom, why did those people want us to be sad?" The question was so direct, so perfectly aimed at the heart of what had happened, that Mara had to take a moment before answering. She'd spent so much energy trying to protect him from understanding the cruelty of it. But Leo saw things clearly in ways adults had learned not to. They didn't want us to be sad exactly, Mara said carefully. They wanted to feel good about helping us. But sometimes people confuse helping with watching. They wanted to watch us be grateful more than they wanted to actually make things better. Leo considered this, his face serious, and then nodded like it made sense to him in whatever way his mind organized information. "I didn't like it there," he said simply. "It was too loud and too bright, and people were looking at me wrong." Mara felt tears sting her eyes because he was right. People had been looking at him wrong, looking at him like he was a problem to be solved or a story to be moved by rather than just a kid who needed space and understanding. "I know, baby. That's why we left, and we're not going back." Leo smiled then, small but genuine, and returned his attention to his cereal. The crisis apparently resolved in his mind now that he had confirmation they wouldn't have to perform for strangers again. An hour later, someone knocked on their door. Mara's first instinct was fear, that it was Carolyn or Mrs. Whitmore or someone from the community center coming to demand an apology or threaten some kind of consequence. But when she opened the door cautiously, she found Eli standing there with a cardboard box in his arms and an expression that might have been nervousness if his face ever showed that much emotion clearly. "I brought something," he said, and held out the box. Inside was a small artificial Christmas tree, the cheap kind from a dollar store, along with a string of white lights and a handful of simple ornaments. "It's not much, but I thought—" Leo mentioned wanting a tree. Mara stared at the box, then at Eli, trying to process the gesture, trying to understand how this quiet man who barely spoke had heard Leo mention a tree when she couldn't remember Leo saying it out loud. She took the box with shaking hands, and Eli shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the attention, ready to leave now that his task was complete. But Mara said, "Stay. Help us put it up?" And after a long pause, Eli nodded once and stepped inside, moving carefully like he was entering a space he wasn't sure he belonged in. Leo appeared from his room, saw Eli, and his face lit up with uncomplicated joy. "You came back," he said, as if there had never been any question that Eli would. They set up the tree together in the living room, Leo directing where each ornament should go with precise instructions, Eli following them exactly because he understood the importance of order and predictability in a way most people didn't. Mara watched them work together, this strange alliance between her son and this damaged, careful man, and felt something settle in her chest that might have been hope or might have been recognition. The recognition that family wasn't always blood, that sometimes it was just people who saw you clearly and decided to stay anyway. When the tree was finished, they sat on the floor around it, and Leo turned off the overhead light so they could see the white lights glow in the dimness. It wasn't the Christmas Mara had imagined. There were no presents underneath, no elaborate decorations, no feast waiting in the kitchen. But Leo was smiling, genuinely happy, and Eli was sitting with them instead of standing alone by a doorway. And Mara realized that maybe this was what Eli had meant about not sticking to the script, that you could write a different ending if you were brave enough to walk off the stage. Her phone buzzed then, breaking the peaceful moment, and Mara almost didn't check it, almost let it go to voicemail. But something made her look, and she saw it was a message from a number she didn't recognize. The text was short. "I was there last night. What you did was brave. I want to help. No cameras, no conditions. Can we talk?" It was signed with just a name, Jennifer, and below that, "I'm a social worker, not a donor." Mara showed the text to Eli, watching his face for some reaction, some sign of whether this was real or just another trap disguised as kindness. He read it carefully, then looked at her with those calm, knowing eyes. "Some people help because it makes them feel good," he said slowly. "Some people help because they actually want things to change. The difference is, the second kind don't need an audience." It wasn't quite an endorsement, But it wasn't a warning either, and Mara decided to take it as permission to hope cautiously. She texted back, "Yes, let's talk." And then she put her phone away and returned her attention to Leo and the tree, and this quiet, imperfect Christmas morning that felt more real than anything that had happened on that stage. They sat together in the glow of cheap white lights while snow continued to fall outside, and for the first time in months, Mara felt like maybe they were going to be okay. Not because someone had saved them, but because they'd saved themselves by refusing to be anyone's story except their own. Over the next few days, the aftermath of the ceremony unfolded in ways Mara hadn't anticipated. The local news ran a story, but not the heartwarming piece the community center had been expecting. Instead, several reporters had picked up on what happened, interviewing people who'd been in the audience, and the narrative that emerged wasn't about ungrateful recipients, but about performative charity and the exploitation of vulnerable families. Mrs. Whitmore issued a defensive statement. Caroline disappeared from social media entirely. Jennifer turned out to be exactly what she'd claimed, a social worker who'd been in the audience that night and had been quietly furious about what she'd witnessed. She met with Mara in a coffee shop. No clipboard, no cameras, just a tired woman with kind eyes who'd spent 20 years watching people fall through the cracks of systems designed to help them. She connected Mara with resources that actually worked: rental assistance with no strings attached, a support group for parents of autistic children, job training programs that didn't require her to share her life story first. Eli started coming by more often, never staying long, never quite comfortable with the messiness of sustained human connection, but showing up nonetheless. He and Leo developed their own language of careful gestures and comfortable silences, and Mara watched her son bloom under the attention of someone who understood what it meant to need the world to be quieter, slower, more predictable. Sometimes Eli would bring things, a puzzle he'd found at a thrift store, a book about trains. Nothing expensive, but everything chosen with thought. One afternoon in early January, when the Christmas decorations had come down all over town and life had returned to its ordinary rhythms, Mara asked Eli why he'd really stood up that night. They were sitting in her living room while Leo played with his cars, and Eli took a long time to answer, staring at his hands like the words were written there in a language only he could read. "Because nobody stood up for my sister," he finally said, and I thought, maybe if someone had, maybe she'd still be here. Mara didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know how to hold space for that much grief without trying to fix it, or minimize it, or make it smaller. So she just reached over and took his hand. And they sat there in silence, while Leo narrated an elaborate story about his toy cars going on an adventure, his voice a bright thread running through the quiet. And Mara thought about how healing doesn't always look like grand gestures or dramatic transformations. Sometimes it just looks like this, like sitting together in the wreckage and choosing not to look away. The weeks that followed taught Mara something she hadn't expected to learn, that the hardest part of refusing to be someone's story wasn't the immediate aftermath, but the slow, grinding work of building a life without the shortcuts charity promised. Jennifer's resources helped, but they didn't solve everything overnight. There were still mornings when Mara counted change for the bus, still nights when dinner was creative arrangements of whatever was left in the pantry, still moments when the weight of single parenthood felt like trying to carry water in her bare hands. But there was a difference now, subtle but significant. When she struggled, she didn't feel like she was failing at a performance someone else had written for her. She was just struggling, which was hard but honest. And honesty turned out to be easier to carry than shame. Leo seemed to feel it too. He was still autistic, still overwhelmed by loud noises and unexpected changes, but he moved through the world with slightly less anxiety, like some invisible pressure had lifted when they stopped trying to be the grateful, inspiring version of themselves that strangers wanted to see. Eli became a strange but steady presence in their lives, appearing at unpredictable intervals, but always when it mattered. He showed up the day Mara's car died in the grocery store parking lot, standing silently beside her while she fought not to cry over the repair estimate she couldn't afford. He didn't offer money or solutions, just presence, and somehow that was enough to help her breathe through the panic until she could think clearly again. Later that week, he mentioned he knew someone who fixed cars as a hobby, someone who might work out a payment plan. The community center tried to reach out several times in those first weeks. Emails from Caroline that started apologetic and gradually turned accusatory. A letter from Mrs. Whitmore's attorney suggesting Mara had violated some unspoken contract by refusing to play her assigned role. Jennifer advised ignoring them, said they were just angry that someone had finally pulled back the curtain on their operation. "They'll move on," Jennifer said. "There's always another family desperate enough to take what you refused. That's the sad part." Mara thought about that often, about all the families who would stand on that stage in future years, who would smile for the cameras and perform gratitude because they didn't have the luxury of refusing, didn't have an Eli to warn them what they were walking into. She thought about writing something, exposing what she'd seen, but the truth was she didn't have the energy or the platform, and part of her was still too close to her own desperation to judge anyone else's choices. Survival made hypocrites of everyone eventually. Leo's school became another battleground, though a quieter one. His teacher meant well, but kept suggesting he'd be more comfortable in the special education classroom, kept framing his differences as deficits that needed to be corrected rather than accommodations that needed to be made. Mara attended meeting after meeting, fighting for her son's right to exist in spaces that weren't designed for him, exhausted by how much energy it took to convince people that Leo's brain wasn't broken, just different. Eli came to one of those meetings, uninvited but not unwelcome, and his presence changed the dynamic in ways Mara couldn't quite name. He didn't speak much, just sat beside her at the conference table, but his calm seemed to fill the room, seemed to make the teachers and administrators slightly less certain in their assumptions. When they suggested Leo needed to try harder to fit in, Eli said quietly, "Maybe the classroom needs to try harder to fit him." And the statement landed with such simple truth that the conversation shifted after that. One evening in late January, Mara came home from her shift at the diner to find Eli sitting on the steps outside her building, which was unusual because he typically called before coming over. He stood when he saw her, and she noticed he was holding a manila envelope, creased and worn like he'd been carrying it for a while. "I found something," he said, "about the giveaway, about what they're really doing with the donation money. I thought you should see it before I decide what to do with it." Inside the envelope were financial documents, emails, records that Eli must have spent weeks compiling. They showed that the Christmas Blessing giveaway received hundreds of thousands in donations each year, but only a fraction actually went to recipients. The rest disappeared into administrative costs and program development, which apparently meant paying Caroline a salary that would have fed every family at that ceremony for a year. There were emails discussing which families would photograph well and which stories had the most viral potential. Mara read through the documents with growing fury, recognizing the calculated cruelty of it, not just the exploitation, but the deliberateness, the way they'd turned poverty into a business model and suffering into content. She looked at Eli, at the careful blankness of his expression that she'd learned meant he was feeling too much to show safely. "Where did you get these?" He hesitated, then said simply, "I know how to be invisible. People don't notice when I'm in rooms I'm not supposed to be in." The question hung between them. What to do with this information? This proof that the charity that had tried to use them was rotten at its core. Mara thought about the families who'd come before her, who'd stood on that stage not knowing they were being exploited. She thought about the families who'd come after, who deserved to know what they were walking into. She thought about Eli's sister, about the strings that had tightened until there was nothing left but shame. "We give it to Jennifer," Mara said finally. "She'll know what to do with it. She'll know how to make sure people see this without it becoming another spectacle." Eli nodded slowly, relief evident in the slight relaxation of his shoulders. He'd been carrying this alone, this evidence of wrongdoing, not sure if exposing it would help or just create more chaos. "I wanted to burn it all down," he admitted quietly. "The building, the whole organization. But that would just hurt the people who work there, the ones who actually believe they're helping. They sat on the steps together while the winter evening darkened around them, passing the envelope back and forth like a dangerous object neither of them wanted to hold for too long. Leo appeared at the window above them, waving down at them, and Mara waved back, struck by the strange tableau they made: a single mother, an autistic man, and a 6-year-old boy. 3 people the world had decided weren't valuable enough to treat with basic dignity, holding evidence that might actually change something. Jennifer met them the next day at the same coffee shop, and her face went pale as she read through the documents. "This is worse than I thought," she said finally. "I knew Caroline was sketchy, but this is fraud, criminal fraud." She looked at Mara and Eli with something like awe. "Do you understand what you're handing me? This could shut them down completely. Every nonprofit in the state will be scrambling to prove they're not doing the same thing." "Good," Mara said and meant it. Jennifer promised to take it to the state attorney general's office, to people who could actually investigate and prosecute. And Mara felt something release in her chest. Not victory exactly, because there was no victory in discovering that your suffering had been someone's profit margin, but something like justice, or at least the possibility of it. She thought about all the Christmas ceremonies that wouldn't happen now, all the families who wouldn't have to perform gratitude for cameras, and felt the weight of it settle strange and heavy. The investigation moved slowly, the way legal things always do, but it moved. News leaked within a few weeks. Local reporters who'd covered the ceremony started asking questions. The state launched an official inquiry, and suddenly the Christmas blessing giveaway was under scrutiny from every angle. Caroline resigned before she could be fired. Mrs. Whitmore issued a statement claiming she'd been misled by her staff and promising to ensure better oversight, which everyone recognized as the kind of non-apology wealthy people give when they've been caught but won't face real consequences. Mara watched it unfold from a distance, trying not to get pulled back into the story now that it was becoming public. Reporters wanted to interview her, wanted her to be the face of the victims, but she'd learned her lesson about performing for cameras. She declined every request, referring them to Jennifer instead, trusting her to tell the truth without turning it into spectacle. Eli had already disappeared deeper into invisibility, avoiding any attention, and Mara understood why. He'd done what he'd come to do, and now he needed to retreat before anyone could make him explain himself. By March, the story had taken on a life of its own, spreading beyond Ashford to regional news and then to national outlets, hungry for stories about corruption disguised as charity. The Christmas blessing giveaway became a cautionary tale, cited in think pieces about performative philanthropy and the exploitation of poverty for emotional content. Other organizations scrambled to distance themselves, promising transparency and accountability, though Mara suspected most of them would just get better at hiding what they were doing rather than actually changing. The families who'd been featured in previous years started coming forward, sharing their own experiences of being used and discarded once the cameras stopped rolling. Eli's sister became part of that narrative, though Eli himself refused to speak publicly about her. Mara watched him retreat further into himself as the story grew, saw the way public attention felt like violence to someone who'd spent his life trying to remain unseen. She worried about him but knew better than to push. Eli would surface when he was ready, or he wouldn't, and either way it had to be his choice. Leo thrived in the relative calm that followed, his world finally quiet enough for him to breathe. His teacher stopped suggesting special education after the meeting where Eli had spoken. And while Mara suspected it was more about avoiding conflict than genuine understanding, she'd take the win. Leo made a friend, another quiet kid who liked arranging things in patterns, and Mara watched them play together with a joy that felt almost painful, because she'd worried he'd never find someone who understood his way of being in the world. Jennifer became something close to a friend, though Mara still struggled with trusting help that didn't come with strings attached. They met for coffee every few weeks, and Jennifer would update her on resources and programs, always careful to frame them as information rather than charity, always respecting the boundaries Mara had learned to defend. "You're doing better than you think," Jennifer told her one afternoon. "I know it doesn't feel like it, but you're building something sustainable. That matters more than quick fixes." The apartment was still small and shabby. The paycheck still stretched too thin, but somehow it felt less desperate than it had in December. Mara got a small raise at the diner. Not much, but enough to stop counting pennies for the bus. She started taking classes online, slowly working toward a degree that might eventually lead to better work, though she tried not to think too far ahead because the future still felt like a luxury she couldn't afford to believe in. Progress was slow and unglamorous. Nothing like the transformation narrative the Christmas ceremony had wanted to sell. One evening in early April, Eli showed up without warning, looking more agitated than Mara had ever seen him. He paced her small living room, hands opening and closing at his sides, struggling to find words for whatever was pressing against his carefully maintained calm. Finally, he said, "They want me to testify, at the hearing, about my sister, about what happened to her." His voice was flat, but Mara could hear the terror underneath it. Terror of speaking, of being seen, of having his grief examined by strangers. Mara understood immediately why he was here, why he was telling her this. He was asking, without being able to ask directly, whether she thought he should do it, whether exposing himself to that kind of attention was worth it if it meant holding people accountable. She thought carefully before answering, weighing what she knew about him against what she knew about justice. "I can't tell you what to do," she said finally. "But I can tell you that you don't owe anyone your pain. Not even for a good cause." Eli stopped pacing, turned to look at her with those calm, sad eyes. "But if I don't speak, if I stay invisible, then they get away with what they did to her. They get to pretend she was just unstable, that it had nothing to do with how they used her." His voice cracked slightly on the word used. And Mara saw him fight to pull himself back together, saw the effort it took to maintain control when everything in him wanted to break. "Then bring someone with you," Mara said. "Don't do it alone. I'll go if you want. Or Jennifer, someone who understands what it costs." Eli considered this. The idea that he didn't have to face this isolated and exposed, that there were people now who would stand beside him, the way he'd stood up in that audience when Mara needed someone to witness. He nodded slowly, and some of the tension left his shoulders, though not all of it. Fear didn't work that way. It just became slightly more manageable. The hearing was scheduled for late April, held in a government building downtown with fluorescent lights and tile floors that made every sound echo. Mara went with Eli, sitting beside him in the waiting area while lawyers and officials moved around them with the purposeful indifference of people for whom this was just another case. Eli's hands were shaking, pressed flat against his thighs to hide the tremor, and Mara wanted to reach over and hold one but knew he couldn't handle touch when he was this overwhelmed. When they called his name, Eli stood slowly, mechanically, and Mara stood with him. "I'm coming with you," she said. And when the official started to protest that only witnesses were allowed, Jennifer appeared from somewhere and said firmly, "He's autistic. She's his support person. It's his right under the ADA." The official backed down, and they walked together into the hearing room, Eli's breathing shallow and quick, Mara's presence beside him the only thing keeping him from fleeing entirely. Eli's testimony was halting and quiet, nothing like the dramatic confrontations Mara had seen in movies. He spoke about his sister in careful, measured sentences, about how the Christmas ceremony had promised help but delivered only exposure, about how she'd been asked to cry on camera and then mocked online for crying, about how the donated money never materialized into the housing assistance she'd been promised. He spoke about finding her in April, about the note she'd left that said she was tired of being everyone's lesson about gratitude. The room was silent when he finished, the kind of silence that feels like witnesses holding their breath. Mrs. Whitmore sat in the back row, her lawyer beside her, and Mara watched the woman's face remain carefully neutral, betraying nothing. Caroline wasn't there. She'd apparently fled to another state rather than face questioning. The investigator asked Eli a few follow-up questions, gentle ones that recognized his difficulty with eye contact and unexpected queries, and then they released him with thanks that sounded hollow against the weight of what he'd just shared. Outside, Eli leaned against the building and breathed like he'd been drowning, like testifying had required him to hold himself underwater for 30 minutes, and he'd barely made it back to air. Mara stood beside him, not touching, just present, waiting until his breathing evened out and the color returned to his face. "You did it," she said finally. "It's over." Eli nodded, but his expression suggested he wasn't sure if over was the right word, that maybe some things don't end, they just become part of the weight you carry differently. Jennifer met them for dinner that evening, her treat, at a quiet restaurant where they could sit in a corner booth away from noise and crowds. She told them the hearing had gone well, that the state was likely to revoke the organization's non-profit status and possibly pursue criminal charges against Caroline. "It won't bring your sister back," Jennifer said to Eli, acknowledging the truth they were all avoiding. "But it might prevent this from happening to someone else." Eli nodded, accepting this small, insufficient justice for what it was. They ate in comfortable silence, three people who'd found each other through trauma and stayed through choice. And Mara thought about how strange and fragile connection was, how you could spend years alone and then suddenly have people who understood without needing explanation. Leo was with a sitter tonight, his first sleepover at his friend's house, and Mara was trying not to anxiously check her phone every 5 minutes, trying to trust that he was okay, that the world wouldn't hurt him while she wasn't watching. "He'll be fine," Jennifer said, reading her mind. "You're allowed to have an evening." Mara laughed, short and sharp, because having an evening felt like a luxury from another life, from before she'd become a single mother fighting every day just to keep them housed and fed. But Jennifer was right. She was allowed this, allowed to sit with friends and eat food. She didn't have to cook and pretend for a few hours that survival wasn't the only thing that mattered. Spring arrived slowly in Montana, reluctant and uncertain. Snow giving way to mud and gray skies that couldn't quite commit to sun. Mara watched the town transform from her diner window during slow afternoon shifts, noticing how people seemed lighter without the weight of holiday expectations pressing down on them. The community center stayed dark most days now, under investigation and essentially shut down, its parking lot empty except for official vehicles that came and went documenting evidence. The story faded from headlines, as stories always do, replaced by fresher scandals and newer outrages, but its effects lingered in ways both visible and invisible. Several other charitable organizations in the state underwent voluntary audits, afraid of being the next to fall under scrutiny. Mrs. Whitmore quietly relocated to Colorado, selling her mansion to a tech entrepreneur who'd made his fortune in cryptocurrency and wanted a rustic retreat. Caroline was arrested trying to board a flight to Mexico with $40,000 in cash she couldn't explain. Eli testified again at Caroline's criminal trial in June, more prepared this time but no less exhausted by it. The jury convicted her on multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement, and the judge sentenced her to 4 years in prison, which felt simultaneously like justice and like nowhere near enough. How do you quantify the damage done by turning people's suffering into entertainment? How do you measure the cost of humiliation disguised as help? The legal system tried with numbers and years, but Mara knew some wounds couldn't be calculated that way. Leo finished first grade with grades that were average and behavior that was manageable, which Mara celebrated like he'd graduated summa cum laude, because she knew how hard he'd worked just to exist in a classroom that wasn't built for minds like his. His teacher gave him a certificate for most improved at taking turns, which was both sweet and slightly condescending. But Leo beamed with pride, so Mara framed it and hung it in the kitchen where he could see it every morning. Summer brought unexpected changes. Jennifer helped Mara apply for a better job at the county social services office, answering phones and doing intake assessments. The pay was better than the diner and the hours were predictable, which meant Mara could actually plan her life more than 2 days in advance for the first time in years. She almost didn't take it, afraid of losing the tips she relied on, afraid of change even when change meant improvement. But Jennifer pushed her gently and Leo said, "You should do it, Mom," with such simple certainty that Mara couldn't argue. The new job was hard in different ways. Emotionally draining, listening to people's problems all day, seeing her own past struggles reflected in every desperate phone call. But it was also strangely healing, using her experience to help others navigate systems that seemed designed to reject people at their most vulnerable. She understood the shame in asking for help, the terror of being judged, the exhaustion of proving you deserved basic dignity. She could hear it in callers' voices and meet them where they were without pity or condescension. Eli got a job too, working at the town library, reshelving books and managing the quiet rooms where people came to escape. It suited him perfectly, structured, predictable, mostly silent, with clear rules and minimal human interaction required. The head librarian was a woman in her 60s who'd raised an autistic son and understood without needing explanation that Eli's calm wasn't coldness, just his way of managing a world that was always too loud and too bright and too much. They fell into a rhythm, the three of them, something that looked almost like family if you didn't examine it too closely. Eli came to dinner every Wednesday, arriving exactly at 6 with groceries he'd pretend he'd bought on sale, but that Mara suspected came from his own meager paycheck. Leo lit up when Eli arrived, dragging him immediately to whatever elaborate car arrangement he'd built that week, and Eli would sit on the floor and listen to Leo's detailed explanations with the same serious attention other adults never managed. One Wednesday in July, Mara made spaghetti while Leo and Eli played in the living room, and she found herself listening to their quiet conversation with something warm expanding in her chest. Leo was asking Eli why people were mean sometimes, and Eli was answering in his careful way, explaining that some people were scared of things they didn't understand, that being different made some people uncomfortable because it reminded them the world was bigger and stranger than they wanted it to be. "But you're not mean," Leo said, and Eli paused before responding. "No, but I used to be scared. Of people, of being seen, of everything. I'm still scared sometimes, but being scared doesn't mean you have to be alone." Mara's throat tightened because she recognized the gift Eli was giving her son. The truth that fear and connection could coexist, that you didn't have to be fearless to be brave, that vulnerability wasn't the same thing as weakness. After dinner, after Leo had gone to bed, Mara and Eli sat on the front steps of her building like they'd done that first night with the manila envelope. The summer evening was warm and soft, fireflies beginning to appear in the scraggly grass of the courtyard, and Mara felt something she hadn't felt in years. Contentment, maybe, or at least the absence of constant panic. "Thank you," she said, not specifying for what, trusting Eli would understand she meant everything. "You helped me too," Eli said quietly. "I was disappearing. Before I met you. Not physically, but in other ways. Letting myself become so invisible that I stopped existing even to myself. You and Leo. You made me remember that being seen doesn't always mean being hurt." His voice was steady, but Mara heard the emotion underneath it, the carefully controlled feeling that he was trusting her with. She reached over and took his hand, and this time he didn't flinch, just held on. August brought Leo's 7th birthday, and they celebrated with a small party, just Leo's one friend from school, Jennifer, Eli, and Mara. No cameras, no strangers, no performance. They ate cake in the park, and Leo opened presents that were thoughtful rather than expensive. A new set of toy cars from Mara, a book about trains from Jennifer, a complicated puzzle from Eli that they'd spend the next month building together. Leo smiled his careful smile and said, "This is the best birthday," without any idea that his simple joy was healing something in all of them. That evening, after everyone had left and Leo was in bed, Mara sat alone in the kitchen with a cup of tea and thought about the previous December, about standing on that stage, about walking away from guaranteed help, about the terror of not knowing if she'd made the right choice. She thought about where they were now, still poor, still struggling, but no longer performing, no longer pretending poverty was beautiful or temporary, or something that could be solved with one night of charity. She'd learned something important in those months, something she was still learning every day. That dignity wasn't a luxury you earned once you escaped poverty. It was a right you claimed while still inside it. That being poor didn't mean you had to accept humiliation as payment for help. That sometimes the cost of survival was too high if it required you to stop being yourself. The lesson was hard and ongoing, and she knew she'd have to relearn it in different contexts for the rest of her life, but at least now she knew it was possible. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. Article coming out tomorrow about the Christmas ceremony scandal. They interviewed several families. Thought you should know. Mara felt her stomach clench reflexively, the old fear that they'd be pulled back into the spectacle. But then she remembered. She'd declined every interview, had maintained her boundaries, had refused to let her pain become content. Whatever the article said, her story belonged to her now, not to anyone else's narrative about poverty and redemption. The article came out in the state's largest newspaper, a long investigative piece that detailed the Christmas blessing giveaway scandal, with the kind of thorough reporting Mara had hoped for, but hadn't quite believed would happen. It featured interviews with 5 families who'd been through the ceremony in previous years, their stories forming a pattern so clear it was damning: promises made and broken, emotional manipulation disguised as generosity, families selected for their ability to generate sympathy rather than their actual need. Eli's sister was mentioned, though carefully, with respect for both her memory and Eli's privacy. The article quoted from his testimony without using his full name, calling him only a family member who wished to remain anonymous. Mara was relieved to see they'd honored that boundary, had understood that some people needed to speak truth without becoming public figures. Caroline's conviction was detailed alongside the financial records, showing how donation money had been diverted, creating a clear picture of systemic fraud rather than isolated mistakes. What surprised Mara most was the final section, which didn't focus on the scandal, but on what came after. The families who'd been helped by Jennifer and other social workers, who'd stepped in when the Christmas ceremony collapsed. The article described a different model of assistance, one based on dignity and sustainability rather than spectacle and performance. It quoted Jennifer extensively, and Mara could hear her friend's voice in every sentence, insisting that poverty wasn't a moral failing and help shouldn't require humiliation. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The newspaper's website crashed from traffic within hours of publication. Other states launched investigations into their own charitable organizations. Nonprofit boards scrambled to implement new oversight policies. Several large donors publicly announced they were redirecting their charitable giving toward organizations that prioritized transparency and recipient dignity. It felt like something was actually changing, though Mara knew better than to trust that feeling completely. Systems were good at appearing to change while staying fundamentally the same. Leo's school called that afternoon, not about Leo but about the article. The principal had read it, had recognized some of the details even though names weren't used, and wanted Mara to know the school would be implementing new policies around how they discussed students' family situations. It was awkward and probably motivated more by fear of bad publicity than genuine understanding, but Mara appreciated the effort anyway. Progress was progress, even when it came from uncomfortable places. Eli showed up that evening looking shaken in a way Mara had only seen once before, the day he'd testified. He came inside without speaking and sat on the couch while Leo immediately climbed next to him, sensing distress in that intuitive way children have. "People are calling me a hero," Eli finally said, his voice flat with confusion and something close to anger. "Online. They found out who I am somehow and they're calling me brave and heroic, and I'm not. I'm just someone whose sister died because nobody stopped them." Mara understood immediately what was happening. How the internet's hunger for heroes was just another form of the same problem, turning real people into stories, into symbols, into whatever narrative made strangers feel good about themselves. "You don't have to be anyone's hero," she said firmly. "You don't have to be anything except yourself." Eli nodded, but didn't look convinced, and Mara realized he was facing the same choice she'd faced on that stage, whether to accept the role people wanted to assign him or walk away from it, even if it meant being misunderstood. Over the next few weeks, the attention gradually shifted away from individuals and toward institutions, which was both a relief and a reminder that systems protected themselves better than they protected people. Mrs. Whitmore's lawyers negotiated a settlement that required her to pay restitution but admitted no wrongdoing. Several board members resigned from the defunct Christmas Blessing organization and immediately joined boards of other charities, carrying their same attitudes and approaches to new venues. Caroline served her sentence in a minimum security facility where she'd be eligible for parole in 2 years. Jennifer organized a support group for families who'd been through similar experiences, and Mara attended the first meeting with equal parts curiosity and dread. 8 families showed up, sitting in a circle in a church basement that smelled like coffee and old carpet, and for 2 hours they shared stories that were painfully familiar. The pressure to perform gratitude, the strings attached to help, the feeling of being exhibited rather than assisted. One woman cried, describing how her children had been photographed without her permission for a nonprofit's promotional materials. A man talked about being asked to exaggerate his disability for a fundraising video. What struck Mara most was how normal they all were, how unremarkable their struggles would seem to anyone who'd ever been poor or known someone who was. They weren't tragic figures or inspiring overcomer stories. They were just people trying to survive in a system that seemed designed to make survival as difficult and degrading as possible. The meeting ended with everyone exchanging phone numbers, building a network of people who understood without judgment. And Mara drove home feeling less alone than she had in years. Fall arrived with its usual drama in Montana, leaves turning gold and red overnight, temperatures dropping so fast you could feel summer dying in real time. Leo started 2nd grade with a new teacher who'd actually read his IEP and seemed committed to following it, and Mara allowed herself to hope that maybe this year would be easier. Eli started volunteering at the library's weekly autism support group, not speaking much but showing up consistently, and Mara watched him slowly become less isolated, less invisible by choice rather than by necessity. Her own life settled into patterns that felt sustainable for the first time since Leo was born. The social services job was stable, the apartment was shabby but paid for, and she'd managed to save enough for a small emergency fund that made her sleep better at night. She enrolled in 2 online classes for spring semester, still working toward that distant degree, still believing in futures she couldn't quite see yet. Progress was slow and unglamorous, and nothing like the transformation narratives people wanted. But it was real, and it was hers. One October evening, Mara received an unexpected email from a producer at a national news network. They were doing a segment on charity fraud and wanted to interview her, offering to fly her to New York and pay her for her time. The email was professional and persuasive, emphasizing that this would be a chance to share her truth and help others avoid similar exploitation. Mara read it 3 times, feeling the old pull of wanting to be heard, wanting her experience to matter, wanting to turn suffering into something meaningful. But she also remembered standing on that stage, remembered the cameras and the lights, and the feeling of being consumed by other people's need for emotional content. She thought about Leo, about how he'd finally found stability and friends and a teacher who understood him. She thought about Eli, about how media attention had made him feel hunted and exposed. She thought about the article that had already told the important parts of the story without requiring them to perform themselves one more time. She deleted the email without responding. Then she made dinner, helped Leo with his homework, and called Eli to confirm their Wednesday plans. These small, ordinary actions felt more revolutionary than any interview could have been. The revolution of choosing privacy over platform, of insisting that her life was hers to live rather than hers to narrate for strangers. The producer sent 2 follow-up emails that Mara also deleted, and eventually they stopped coming, and she felt nothing but relief. November brought the first serious snow, and with it a kind of reckoning Mara hadn't anticipated. The calendar was marching toward December, toward the anniversary of that ceremony, and she found herself thinking about it more than she wanted to. Not with regret exactly, but with a complicated mixture of emotions she didn't quite know how to name. Pride that she'd walked away, grief for what walking away had cost, anger at a system that made walking away feel like the only dignified choice. If this story made you think differently about charity and dignity, hit subscribe, because these voices deserve to be heard without performing for cameras. Drop a like if Mara and Eli's courage resonated with you, and tell us in the comments. Have you ever had to choose between help and your self-respect? Your story matters, and sometimes knowing you're not alone is the most powerful thing we can share.